Hi everybody, how's it going? So I decided to use this piece of firewood that I had and try to make something cool out of it. This is a piece of black walnut that happens to be a crotch piece that was originally intended to be firewood from a local spot here near me. I actually grabbed a bunch of this walnut firewood just because I thought it would make interesting projects later on. With this particular piece, I decided that I was going to make a lidded pot on the lathe and do an end grain turning for it. So the first step was to remove all the bark off the outside of the firewood, and as you can see, my hatchet actually broke, the handle snapped on it. So I decided just to use the head to knock it off. But this is just to make it where it is easier to fit through my bandsaw and square it off to the dimensions I'd like to start turning. After knocking all the bark off of it, I ran it through the bandsaw, dimensioning it down to where I needed. Now, I did use the hatchet and split a few of the edges off of it just to make it where it would fit through my 10-inch bandsaw, as the particular bandsaw I have only has about an 8.5-inch cutting depth. Now, after that, I just squared off the log and made it into a blank that I was at least comfortable trying to turn on the lathe, as this would be a little crazy in the beginning with it being an end grain turning piece. After that, I grabbed my drill and a 1.25-inch Forstner bit and drilled a bit of a mortise into it, and this is just to allow me to chuck up this particular blank to make the bowl on the lathe. Without this, you would actually use the faceplate and drill screws into that to hold it to the lathe, but I decided to go ahead and just use a Forstner bit so I could hook it directly to the chuck in the beginning. So I started turning, and I will be honest, I was a little nervous as the way the blank was shaped, it was not squared and not rounded. It caused a lot of vibrations, so I just took my time with a scraper and started to round over all the corners. Every now and then I would stop and take a chisel and just round off some of the sharp corners a little more. And eventually I got it down into a really manageable cylindrical shape and actually started shaping the pot from there. After drilling out the center with a 1.25-inch Forstner bit, I used a couple of different round nose scrapers and shaped out the inside of the bowl, getting the bottom as flat as I could and dimensioning out the sides of the bowl to about the thickness I really wanted to keep. Next was to shape and cut to size what was going to be the base that this was actually going to mount on with a 1/2-inch tenon. So I drilled out the base that way I could actually flip it around on the chuck, and then milled out the front on the lathe with the design I wanted so that it fit flush against the bottom of the pot. Now, to make the lid, I actually had to grab another piece of the walnut firewood that I had and split it down the center, as the piece I had left over from earlier was not wide enough to do an end grain turn and get the pattern of the grains I wanted into the lid. So I grabbed a different piece and used the bandsaw to mill it down to a couple of inches thick and rounded off the corners, and then proceeded to turn it on the lathe, turning it to size so it would fit pretty close to the edges of the pot, and also milling down a small tenon on the back so that it would actually fit snugly inside of the pot and not move around. I used a set of calipers set to the dimensions of the inside of the pot to cut the tenon on the back of the lid. That way the lid would fit snugly inside and hold itself in place. After finishing up the back side, I focused on the front, using a round-nosed radius chisel to shape out the front, and then a square scraper to cut a small mortise into it that the finial tenon would fit into. For the finial, I decided I was going to use ambrosia maple to give a little contrast to the rest of the walnut, as I didn't want everything to be exactly the same. Now, I did try to do this with some zebra wood and a previous piece before this, and had some complications, both of them getting damaged, so I'd started over. So the easiest way to do this was to keep cutting down the tenon that would eventually fit into the lid, checking your progress as you go. And then once the tenon was to the shape you wanted, then you shape the rest of your finial as you would like. I decided to do an interesting rounded shape with different levels to it. And honestly, just kind of let the wood talk to me as I did this, and come out with a shape that I really liked and I thought looked really interesting. After your finial is shaped and sanded down just a couple of times, it is time to remove it from the rest of the blank. You do this with the parting tool, taking your time and being sure not to cut down into the piece you're wanting to keep, but better yet, just make sure you catch the piece and gently cut through the rest of the remaining material, holding it to your blank. As I had stated earlier, this is a piece of firewood, so it is a little damp. So I decided to use my kitchen oven set at 215 degrees for an hour and actually bake the pieces of wood from the project. And this would dry them out completely, and I wouldn't have to worry about moisture being in them anymore after that. During the drying process, it did pick up a few stress cracks, so I used some epoxy with black dye to fill in those cracks and just sanded everything back down really well and started the finishing process. After I got everything cleaned up, it was time to add a half-inch dowel into the bottom of the pot that fits into the base. Now this would connect the two and allow me to glue the two together, as I had not cut a dowel or anything like that into either one on the lathe. And also with this, it made it much easier for me to use a half-inch piece of pre-made dowel that would fit in there quickly and easily and made the process much simpler. I used my drill to drill in a half-inch hole in the bottom of the pot, and then used the drill chuck on the tailstock of the lathe with a half-inch Vossner bit to drill in a mortise at the bottom of the base plate. Everything cut and ready, I ran it through a quick test fit just to make sure everything was going to fit together seamlessly as I hoped, and then added some black dyed CA glue to the base, as I had caused a small pinhole in the bottom of it with the tip of the Forstner bit, and some clear CA glue on the top of the dowel and inside the mortise of the pot, pushing them together with some activator. That way, in just a couple of seconds, everything is together and solid, and there's no waiting involved. For finish, I decided to go with a two-step process. The first step was to use mineral oil, as it actually brought out all the grains of walnut amazingly. Especially with walnut, the mineral oil darkens up all the dark layers and actually creates these beautiful contrasts and a chatoyancy in the walnut that just can't be matched. Now, I'm also going to use Turner's wax and polish the outside of the pot just to give a little bit of a glossy sheen to it. Now, I'm not going to use mineral wax on the inside because I honestly see no need to. The inside is not going to get light, so you're not going to see a glossy surface, so it's work that is not needed in my opinion. But this mineral oil on walnut just brings everything out, and it looks absolutely gorgeous. If you have never used Turner's wax or Turner's polish, there is one thing I would really like to mention is if you're doing any projects with it, one of the things that help create that glossy shine with a Turner's wax is actually heat. So it's okay to keep your lathe on a lower speed, but what I like to do is get it kind of rubbed in and slightly polished at a slower speed, and then kick my lathe up into a higher speed and really polish it off to a higher shine. and let it heat up just a little bit. As with the turner's wax, the heat actually causes more of a glossy surface to appear. With the body of the pot complete, it was time to repeat the same finishing processes on the lid. Now, once this mineral oil gets on the lid in the video, you'll really be able to see what I'm talking about with the chatoyancy of the walnut. This is why I like to do mineral oil onto especially walnut and these darker colored woods before I polish them out, because the walnut just pops with the mineral oil, and the wax actually causes it to have a longer lasting higher shine that the mineral oil would not have once it's wiped off. With Turner's wax, you also want to add the layer that you're going to be using to wax whatever project you're working on without the lathe on. What this does is allow you to cover the entire project, and it allowed it to dry just a little bit, kind of like what you do with automotive wax. But instead of using a buffer, your cloth or rag becomes the buffing wheel once you turn on the lathe. Another thing to note is on items or projects kind of like this finial with deeper small pockets, make sure to keep the speed of your lathe down as you finish that piece, as you will use your cloth to press into the grooves to remove the wax. And if the speed is too high, or if you hold the cloth or rag too long on that particular edge, it will burn in and you will have to refinish that portion of the project again. When I spoke of the chatoyancy of this walnut, this is what I mean by it. You can see how the light reflects off, giving almost like a holographic quality to the grains. I am super excited on how this come out. This is only my second pot to do like this, but it's absolutely beautiful, and I really appreciate it, guys. Make sure you subscribe, and make sure you go hit me up on Instagram and give me a follow for daily videos, and I will see you guys next time.